Now, we have heard from each of our organised speakers, and I'm keen to hear if anyone in that group has a question for a previous speaker or one of the other speakers. Let's open that up. Megan, you spoke only briefly about your Lendlease experience, but I was interested in, I suppose, contrast, but also maybe in parallel to Adrian's experience from a government point of view. You know, what made it difficult in the procurement challenge for you to get what you'd seen overseas? Was it a guideline? Was it an engineering standard? Was it, you know, inability to get ISCA points? What was the barrier?
So our primary barriers related to pretty much the maturity of our supply chains. We as a construction company rely very heavily on our providers to provide us a finished product that they can bring to site and install in situ. Some of those suppliers that we tend to deal with, we do look quite broadly, and we ask people to come to us with their suggestions on how they would achieve the things that we want them to achieve. But we found that it was going to add additional time to our programs because we weren't really set up from the beginning to explore these particular options. Having been through that process now, we've learned a lot about what our supply chain looks like from a cradle to gate perspective. And it's certainly learnings that we can apply, knowing that we need to engage earlier with our supply chain for future products. In this particular example, though, we approached it from we had some data, but we approached our procurement from a business as usual timing perspective rather than shifting it forwards like we're going to need to do for future jobs to be able to engage with some of these opportunities.
Okay, so the time impact of a different supplier or different material has to be factored in way up front, I take it.
Quite a lot up front. We were finding it was going to be in the order of several months up front to our program, just because it meant that our supplier was going to have to shift some of their actual manufacturing processes. So where a lot of our aluminium and a lot of our procurement, a lot of our facade manufacturing does happen abroad, as Jeff was sort of mentioning. It would still have to happen potentially abroad, potentially domestically, but we'll be looking at new facilities, new technology, new equipment, and to get some of that up and running at the scale that we would require it was going to take a fair bit of time investment.
Can I just add a little bit to that, Hudson?
Please do.
So I guess in my experience, I rang up Emacs and the people that produced the billet with Alcoa for the Masdar project, and I've had an ongoing conversation with them. They took it quite high up into their board management to talk about the possibility of shipping overseas, but they came back and said they're not interested in doing it anymore. They had considered it in the past, but I think costs of doing so, or taxes or levies, or stuff that's way outside of my scope of expertise, kind of said to them, look, we're just really happy supplying to the European market. And with Hydro, I think the interesting thing with Hydro is that they're a massive company, like Rio, but they actually own, one of the subsidiary companies is a facade extruder that produce and manufacture facades. So I think the head of sustainability I was talking with said that 90 or 95% of their Circal product or billet is channeled into their own subsidiary for their own sort of use in their facades. So it's very difficult to get hands on it outside of that circle.
Okay, that's very interesting.
But it may offer a way forward here. Like I think Capral, buy a lot of their billet from Rio Tinto, so it could be something like that might unlock something. Okay,
well, Ashley was talking about the need for a demand signal. I wonder if that's part of the signal.
And there was a great question on that, just to jump in, Hudson, actually, there was a question like, how do we send the demand signal? I think that could be the power of MECLA. I think if you're at the scale of a Rio Tinto as a primary producer, noting again, I guess to Margie and Fiona's point, they're just one part of a supply chain. We need to think that, in an integrated fashion, there's Capral, there's the extruders and etc. But how do we send that demand signal to them? And I think this really comes down to the power of the collective, that unified voice of a key industry and sector saying, look, we really want to achieve these outcomes. And to, Megan's point as well, it's, how do we actually send those signals, and in time, give time to make decisions, to identify the value proposition. I'm also seeing some questions in the chat here. Is it just a financial consideration? Logistics in our country often make or break the movement of materials and the different types of partnerships we can have because we are so geographically spread. And so I think but what we're seeing with the ESG, or more broadly the sustainability agenda, is that I think that the tipping scales are not just purely financial anymore. It's a value proposition for companies, a license to operate, especially for the primary producers. So I think the opportunity is actually now, but it is how do we articulate and send a clear demand signal, and also think about those key material specifications, given that aluminium goes into so many different products and alloys. Not all of those are easily nor readily recyclable. And I guess that's to my point about strategic alignment and finding that right fit and just starting somewhere. I mean, I'm a big advocate for let's just start. It is hard. There are barriers that have been mentioned today, but I think it's possible. Absolutely.
I'm just wondering how many different lives the aluminium in my drink bottle has had before it got to clear the frog in my throat.
Hudson, if I can jump in on that, I think that it depends at what level do you say, is there a demand signal? I mean, clearly primary producers, there isn't a primary producer, I don't think, certainly amongst the global players that we've talked about today. Rio Tinto, Alcoa, Hydro, who is indirectly a member of mine through their involvement in the Tomago smelter, Rusal, they all have ambition to all have a net zero, a long-term emissions reduction ambition, but they are long-term. To Megan's point, even about the time it takes to change technology in one part of the process, you're talking about decarbonising an industry. The industry's been running for 100 years. Many of the technologies that we're looking at now, things like inert anodes, I know I've been involved in research on those for more than 20 years, and we're now at the commercialization, and then we need to get to deployment. So I think to say there is no demand signal is incorrect. I think there is a strong demand signal, but you've got to allow time in some cases for technology to evolve and be commercialized. Also, there is a financial signal. These companies all have a price of carbon built into their models. Whether or not the price of carbon exists on the ground in the policy settings of the countries in which they operate is irrelevant. They all have the price of carbon built into every decision that they make. And they all know that in the long term, but in the very long term, there will be financial incentives and the financial benefit of being the first to make green aluminium. And they are all on that race, and they're running as fast as they can to get there. But it will take time. So I think that you just have to, and also there is a big disconnect in the Australian market between what we produce and what we consume. Not much of what we consume here is produced in Australia. So also going to Adrian's point, when you look at procurement standards, when you are just setting a procurement standard on one set, as Fiona also said, one set of ESG requirements, carbon recyclability, that's one thing. Australian made, where does that also fit? And do you want Australian, where does the Australian made and the Australian content and the Australian bauxite versus Australian alumina versus Australian aluminium, how are those ranked in terms of the different procurement decisions? So I think everybody is running I'm really confident, maybe I'm the optimist, but I'm really confident we're all running in the same direction. Sometimes though, we just need to allow a little more time, and it's not months, it's not years. It will take most of the time till between now and 2050 to get to a complete zero carbon alumina and aluminium in Australia, but we will get there, I'm very confident.
And I'll just add, just on that financial piece, I think a huge part of that, because these are capital intensive industries, is the investment that's needed to make those transitions. So the financial sector and their, rapid and increasingly accelerating shift to ESG factors in investment decisions is a huge part of that, but that also kind of takes time to kind of be them working out their metrics, where those investments are, what those kind of particular priorities are, where those investments happen in terms of geography. So we're certainly seeing, you know, more happening in Europe because of the larger capital investment market there. But there's also interested, obviously, as Margot said, in kind of large capital intensive assets in Australia, like refiners and smelters and so on. So, you know, the slide that I had that shows the global mass flow, those volumes, you can go to the International Aluminium, well, if you go to our site, you can find it. It shows you how that volume of production has been stepping up year on year on year, and there's projections, you know, continuing out as well. So obviously new capacity added adds that opportunity, but there's not a massive amount of new capacity being added in Australia. We've got kind of mature sort of operations here at this point. So there's decisions now being made about, well, what does that transition look like? Or does it look like shutting it down? You know, so we're going to see some rapid shifts, you know, over the next 10, 15 years, but it will be those kinds of timeframes, and as sort of a signal from a project that you're interested in this when you look at the volumes globally and the concentration and capital intensive nature of production is not enough of a signal. 10 OEMs getting together, sure, you know, that might start to send a little bit more of a signal for a sector that uses maybe, you know, 20-25% of kind of the aluminium production, and it itself is concentrated. So I think that's a real challenge for the sector, is just the fragmentation. And the cost, you know, the cost piece in all of these projects remains significant, you know, so to kind of say, oh, we'd pay, you know, another $5 or whatever for this or that, and it's one kind of customer, that's not enough to make that sort of really billion-dollar investments.
And there's a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
There's one from Anne, and this is to Adrian. How strictly would something like a weighted system be honoured by agencies in your experience? Is money always going to prevail as the primary differentiator? And have you seen any non-financial criteria tip the scale?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Thanks for the question. And I've jotted down some notes here. Now, look, I think from my experience, probably the easiest way to explain this is in a procurement process, just say you've got 100 points to give in the race, which is the procurement. And you think of just the standard things you're going to ask: program, capability of the team, your price, your safety, and perhaps local participation. There's 5 commonly used sort of criteria in any government assessment. And then we add on environment or diversity, female participation, Indigenous participation. You rapidly run out of room to give points to different things. So what I'm saying is that, therefore, so just say you are keen on a low carbon outcome, you allocate 10 points out of 100 to it. Well, someone who does a massively great job might get 9 points out of 10. Someone who does a reasonably average job in this aspect of the weighted assessment criteria gets a 6. Well, the difference is 3 points out of 100. So it's not so much, I think, that agencies don't honour the process, which I believe they do. It's more, where are the points allocated and how do they wash out together? So I suspect procurement's part of it, but you couldn't rely on one set of weighted assessment criteria to make the biggest impact, because it has to play in a very crowded space of weighted assessment criteria. And from what I've seen around governments is more and more governments are trying to get additional value out of procurements. So they are actually broadening their weighted assessment criteria out of the traditional, you know, hard dollar program capability and wanting to add on different values. But environment is only one of them, and there's many other values. So I think going back to where I started, I think there is a variety of things we need to do, not just one silver bullet. And probably my question, which not only to this forum, aluminium, because it'll go across all the products, is from a government perspective, right, we can rely on rating tools, we can rely on procurement, we can do different things, but actually probably what we want is a very, very objective way to analyse the outcome of a specific design. Yeah, how many tonnes of carbon is it producing? And I think I heard the comment that that's not as easy as it sounds. And that's, I'll have to reflect on that, because I didn't realise that it would be that hard to just, you know, here's your product spec, here's the product you're providing the market, and here's its carbon content. I mean, that's what I want as a purchaser. That's really simple. I don't have to do my own life cycle analysis to bloody work out whether, you know, am I being duped here, or, you know, there's a whole set of accounting structures that go behind it. So over time, I hope that we can get to simpler ways to measure that carbon, so as a procurer, it's quite easy to know.
Monica, do you want to take another from the chat?
Well, I just wanted to respond to Adrian first. That's exactly what MECLA is trying to do with some of our working groups. We know it's not easy, and we have some great people in the working groups who are trying to answer that question to make it simpler for you and procurement agencies to do that.
Thank you.
We've had a few people answer questions. Thanks, Kerry.
I might just throw in one while you're looking for one. In terms of procurement, you know, working with Stockland, you know, proposing this to them, you know, we know it's going to be a tough journey, but there's the other side of thing that says, you know, well, could we be the first building in Australia to have a recycled aluminium facade? You know, we know that the demand for tenants in the commercial sector is high, and tenants globally are looking for buildings and developments that align to their own values around sustainability. So I also think there's that sort of narrative or more sort of intangible, almost marketing side of things that is also quite a big push and could be something in the future that makes that drive happen.
I think just to touch on Jeff's point, also working with one of the large property developers and looking at their supply chain, actually identifying where the aluminium they were using was coming from, we found that it was coming from Germany. And I think to the point that Adrian just had, there's the product-based emissions, and then there's the scope 3 supply chain related emissions, of which there is a lack of understanding even where our products are really deriving from. And as we've seen on some of the slides earlier, this is an extremely complex sector with so many different layers. You know, who's actually procuring the product? You know, it's often not the developers, it's the architectural firms, or it's the contracted builder. And then they're getting the product in, and there's due diligence, but there's not traceability and transparency in some of these key data points often, and more broadly to every material used. So it's to say, yes, it's really complex, but again, I think just trying to promote there's optimism. There are signals being sent. I think they need to be stronger. I think the integrated approach, everybody's got a role to play in this, not just the primary producers, the fabricators, manufacturers, extruders, the users of the end product, and those that recover the aluminium when it's reached end of first use. There's just a lot more I think we could do collectively. And this is the point of MECLA. So again, it's complex, but it's possible.
Yeah, and I want to add, I hope I haven't sound pessimistic. I guess I'm just trying to explain some of the challenges that you're kind of facing in Australia. We have a huge amount of optimism in ASI. We've grown our membership, you know, between 30 and 50% year on year on year, even during the pandemic. We still see people committed to sustainability, putting in place and expanding certifications and so on. It's just that it does take time, you know, with the chain of custody piece, which is where you can start to kind of have clarity and assurance around those sorts of responsible sourcing dimensions. We've had sort of, you know, only a couple of years of that starting to kind of happen. So that maturity will come. I think that the passion is kind of there. The industry, I think, sees itself as part of the solution. You know, aluminium's used in kind of lightweighting and thermal efficiency and kind of packaging, you know, food goods to stop waste. You know, all of those kinds of things are part of what the industry sees as the aluminium story. But there are things that take time to have those transitions because of that capital intensive nature. And when you're in a small market like Australia, you're going to have these challenges of distance and cost. So you might be kind of last. You might be seeing it in Europe. You might be able to access it from there. But having a kind of a domestic ecosystem for this, it's harder for the smaller ones to get started.
Look, thank you everybody very much for your participation today. To our speakers, I commented to each of them before we started that a 10-minute slot on a national Zoom meeting requires many hours of preparation and a career's worth of experience. So really appreciate the contribution. There is a lot in the MECLA pipeline. I'd like to remind everyone that June is case study month. You should have received a template already, but if not, please do shout out. This is a great opportunity, terrific opportunity to share your experience, your insights, even your war stories on what's happening around low carbon, zero carbon construction materials. We'll be holding further spotlight events They're coming up. At the moment, steel and cement are vying to be the next one, and we'll let that play out and keep you informed. We've also got the promised procurement masterclass coming up in coming months. And there is a lot of doing to keep being done. So let's keep up the momentum. Let's keep going. Thank you everybody for your time and contribution today. As I said at the beginning, this session has been recorded, so that will be available as well. And if someone has said something that you really want to follow up, I hope you can make contact with them. I've got some notes on who I want to talk to after this. But emphatically, thank you very much for your time. Monica, thank you for making this happen and organising it behind the scenes. To our speakers, to our members, thank you very much and stay tuned. I look forward to engaging and doing with you in the months to come. Thanks very much, everyone.